Okay, we are now have come to the last session of this symposium. My name is In Ang, and I'm also one of the members of the Art of Engagement team. Can I ask the four speakers in the final panel to come here? That's Frank Panucci, Director of Community Partnerships of the Australia Council, Lisa Havilah, Director of the Campbelltown Arts Centre and one of the cultural partners in C3 West, Tony Bennett, Professor of Social and Cultural Theory at the Centre for Cultural Research, and Ross Gibson, Professor of Contemporary Arts at the University of Sydney. Now, the idea of this last session is really to reflect on what we have learned today. I hope that all of you have come away now really inspired by what we have learned about what C3 West is trying to achieve on the national and mostly international examples that we have been given, both in the talks by Michael Critchman and Karen Becker. And I think also in the very kind of like, I think the workshop this morning with the people involved in the developments in Penrith, Max Cohen, the two Craigs and John Kirkman, gave us a sense of what it takes to kind of engage in the work of engagement and putting artistic practices like these on the map. What we will do here is to have each of the panel members reflect on what they have learned today and their own perspectives on it for about 5 minutes each, or you can take a few more minutes, but I think it's good really to keep a lot of time for all of you to kind of enter into an open discussion after that. So I'll give the word first to Frank.
Thanks, I was both lucky enough and unfortunate enough to have just started back at the Australia Council to help establish a community partnerships section and the community partnerships funding program when Liz Ann McGregor, Jock McQuinney and Congoria just made a phone call and asked if we were interested in supporting a project called C3 West. There was no way of them knowing where to put an application to the Australia Council. There was it wouldn't fit into the Visual Arts Board, it didn't fit into the Community Partnerships new section, didn't fit into anything really, so they were trying to find the way of getting into a funding agency with a great idea and how do you get money for it. That's a big learning curve for a funding agency. That we took away, and I think the importance of C3 West from a funding agency's perspective, the Australia Council in particular, and for me personally in setting up a new section of the Australia Council was how do you go about setting up funding programs which actually create environments to allow experimentation and innovation in practice, particularly in community engagement practices, to actually take place and be led by the sector rather than being led by the funding agency. How do you get away from a notion of prescription and to a certain sense dogma, and to allow that new space to be constantly created and tested by the field itself? It wasn't an easy road for us. The first time the proposal went to our new Community Partnerships Committee, it only approved half the money that was required by C3 West. Further discussions took place, and we managed to secure extra funding through what was then called a notion called Strategic Initiatives Funding, which was others might call the hollow log that sits inside all funding agencies, that actually led to supporting C3 West. But I think the interesting thing for me about the progression of C3 West and the learnings that we take away from it as the Australia Council is that engagement with communities, how agencies, artists and diverse members of our community all engage, is becoming more and more a part of general discourse. If you had to ask us 10 years ago where we were around this whole notion of engagement and where community arts and community cultural development sat in the grander scheme of culture, cultural discourse and arts discourse in Australia, I think we would always consider to be on the margins. But I was talking with Jock McQuinney, and Jock and I have known each other for a longer period of time that we're prepared to mention out here publicly. But when Jock first did a project down in Tasmania, when he's working for the Tasmanian Trades and Labour Council, working in a site of a pulp mill using a contemporary opera company called EHOS Opera to deal with issues of social dislocation because of new owners taking over a pulp mill. That happened a long time ago, and that was considered to be a project which was so innovative and so out there in a sense that nothing like that was funded again for another 9 years through the Australia Council. But I think what I'm trying to say is this, that the notion of where communities sit, the role that communities play, not only in terms of being consumers, but creators, participants, co-creators of work, and finally becoming the arbiters of the new aesthetic and the new excellence, is where we're moving towards. I think C3 West is a classic model of, putting the toe around that, and I think there are more and more projects around the country that are actually following that model. And I think the advantage that we've had with C3 West from the start was to actually have University of Western Sydney, Centre for Cultural Research, sitting there alongside from the start, to be able to both document, provide critical input, and we know that there'll be a production at the end of a publication and a reflection and of an analysis and learnings for all of us to take from that. And that's also been another part of our learnings as the Australia Council, and in particular with community partnerships, the role that research and evaluation plays in these kind of projects. There is no magic model that can be developed. There is no codified exemplar of these the steps you'll have to take whenever you do one of these projects, because in reality, they are all determined by the organic nature of the interactions and the communities and the individuals involved in those particular projects. There is one underlying thing, I think, that C3 West, and came out today as well, which is that drives all these projects. To have the time, the space, the resources to develop the mutuality of trust amongst all the partners involved in the projects, from the individual community organisations, from the commercial partners, the artists, the cultural brokers and the cultural institutions. To be able to develop a level of trust where frank and open conversations can be had and where people can actually walk away from the table and from the project feeling that no one has basically, disappointment, yes, but not acrimony. And I think that that's the thing that's really important. If we don't actually spend the time, the resources to develop mutuality of trust, these projects will never come off. And I think that we at the funding agencies have to understand too the importance of individuals and the role of individuals in developing and brokering those relationships. And the tenacity of Lisanne McGregor in sort of pushing through with C3 West, the charm and influence and the capacity of John Kirkman, where's John, or has he already left, in sort of working out in Penrith, and at the time Con, running Casula, who was prepared to give to the process and the partnership, the relationships that he'd developed over 20 years in Western Sydney, are all things that should never go underestimated nor undervalued. And in all of that mix, all the other players are involved, but to have someone like Jock McQuinney, whose great skills of being a cultural broker were brought to bear, and to bring some of those partners together, I think are things that we need to make sure that when we do the analysis and the review that the University of Western Sydney is doing, that those things are also clearly looked at, and to understand what competencies and skills and experience those individual players have brought to bear on that particular project. But at the end of the day, all the projects we're involved in are about the artists and the communities to collaborate together in co-producing the works. And obviously the selection of the artist and the working with the artist, and I suppose assisting the artist at times to acquire that new sort of set of skills and competencies required to work sometimes in community spaces, is all part of that mix. But selection of artists and a frank and open conversation with artists at the start has also been a hallmark of C3 West, which is something that we've taken away. I think we've already gone over 5 minutes, yeah? Okay. The last thing I'd like to say in reality is about when you actually talk about communities and their engagement, the one thing that through a lot of the presentations today that got to me was the set of values that actually drive our engagement with communities. We always run a risk between exploitation, the use of the communities as fodder for creative elements, creative stimulation for then artists to go off and do their work. The value of collaboration co-production, co-creation, and the capacity to allow communities to actually be determined as an arbiters of excellence and artistic product is a difficult thing to do. But if we want to go down that way, we actually need to, all of us need to come to an understanding what are the underlying values of having communities involved from moments of conception, inception, production, presentation, evaluation in all our projects. And that is not an easy road to go down. But I think if we don't go down that way, we'll end up having more and more instances where we'll have communities that just feel that they are being exploited rather than being part of a process. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hi there. As someone from a brick veneer institution, as John Kirkman outlined earlier, in southwest Sydney, Campbelltown Arts Centre, I've just got a few reflections or questions on what has been a very interesting day. And I'd like to thank both the MCA and the University of Western Sydney for bringing us all together. And I think a sign of how the quality of today is that there are more questions than answers when we look at these projects. So I'll start with the first question. Where does the innovation lie in community engagement projects? One answer to this, and I think the key answer, is time. In long, open-ended periods of engagement. This is something that community engaged projects in Western Sydney have been particularly good at, continually testing models of bringing artists and communities together, with some projects being delivered over 4 to 6 year periods and sometimes with no presentation outcome. So I think the key innovation in C3 West as a project is that there isn't an end point, that the potential of the projects that are included in the overall plan aren't constrained by a timeline, that the projects stay true to a process. I also think one of the most interesting questions in the projects of C3 West and community engagement projects generally is, where is the art? Is the art in the presentation of Craig Walsh's photographs, in the photographs? Is that the art? Or is the art in the movement of the footballers and fans in front of the camera at the end of the game? Or is it in the meeting between John, Jock and Max in the back room of the Panthers club? Is that the art? I don't think the answer is clear, and I think the art is right through the project. But it does show a need to think differently about the ways that we present publicly and translate these projects to the broader community. My next question is, does context equal excellence? The resourcing of processes for community engagement provides opportunities for artists to have access to ideas and contexts that normally would be unavailable. These contexts are particularly rich within contemporary suburban Sydney, where there isn't at the moment, I don't think, a more exciting place or culturally rich place to be involved in the production of contemporary art. It is where people live and where the political and social future of the country is being played out. In a similar way, the San Diego-Tijuana border is a culturally rich site that is defined by the movement of people. I think in the end, community engagement doesn't equal compromise, but equals more. Next question. What are our ethical responsibilities to what's left behind? I wonder if the group of community members that worked with Javier Tellez in that extraordinary work have gone on to make other performances. The power that an artist and a project has to shine a light onto an issue or a group of people cannot be underestimated, and can be transformative for people and life transformations. The artist moves on to the next project, and the question is, what is left behind in the community needs to be planned for and resourced. There needs to be not only entry strategies, but real and considered exit strategies. My next question is, can the bureaucrats beat the politicians? I'm not sure of the answer, but long-term engagement projects such as C3 West provide many challenges for governments whose strategies and policies sometimes run only between election cycles. To provide ongoing and sustained resourcing and support requires in some instances both faith and bravery. When to identify concrete outcomes at the time of deciding to significantly support a project could limit at the same time the potential of the project and the natural processes that specifically respond to the issue or idea that may or may not be used in the construction of the work. Sometimes it only takes a couple of people within an organisation or a funding body to change the direction and to provide significant opportunities for projects like this to happen. And my final question is, can project models such as C3 West be applied and translated? I don't think there is a blueprint for community engagement. The critical resource is documenting processes and outcomes, and that is something that isn't done very well in Australia in both the arts and cultural sector. And the practice of in community engaged projects that work with contemporary artists to a degree has been an invisible practice. C3 West, I think, is making a significant contribution to making this work more visible in new ways, which I think and hope will have flows and impacts onto the broader sector. Thanks.
Okay, I too, like everyone else, am pleased to be here. One of the things that Ian didn't mention when introducing me is that I've been working with the Centre for Cultural Research. This is my third day, I think, so I'm very much a new boy on the block. Some of you may know I worked in Australia before. I worked in Australia for most of the 1980s and 1990s, and then went to work back in the United Kingdom for a period from 1998 until the present. And what I want to do in my comments today is just to reflect a little bit on some of my experiences and kind of like engagements with questions about the relations between art, culture and society across Britain and Australia in ways that relate to the presentations that we've had today about engaged forms of public art. And the kind of, in the first presentations this morning, they brought to my mind a quotation from, or not a quote, but a passage from the work of Bruno Latour, the French social theorist, in his book Pandora's Hope, where at one point he says, pilots don't fly aeroplanes, airlines do. And the kind of like, the consequence you draw from that is that artists don't make art, art institutions do. Artists, of course, have a role, but it's art institutions that make art. Just like without airlines, the plane will never get up off the ground. Without bureaucrats, without funding mechanisms, without people to liaise between artists and the community, between knowledge institutions and so on, the art wouldn't happen. And it's also fairly clear, I think, from the presentations that we've had today that these kind of projects of engaged forms of public art traverse the relationships between art and society in complicated ways. They traverse the relationships between the art field and the social field in various complicated ways. They are inscribed in the life of society in complex and contradictory ways. And some of these issues were referred to, I think, or the kinds of issues that I want to engage with here, were referred to in the introductory remarks by Lisanne McGregor and by Elaine Lally, in the points that they were making about the relationships between the presentations that we've had relating to public art projects and art institutions like this one, the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art. And they both alluded to the kind of, some of the difficulties around these relationships with trying to disconnect the public art projects from the kind of the conventional elite associations of the institutions of art. And I want to suggest that's not quite so easily done, not in a critical way or a negative way, but really by way of underlining the fact that one of the sets of issues, and it's an important set of issues that critical public arts projects have to engage with, are the complicated ways in which, like it or not, art practices are inscribed in the social field and play a very consequential role in relationship to the processes through which social divisions are organised and perpetuated in societies like ours. These contradictions and tensions are not easily wished away, and they've surfaced from time to time in the discussions. The person whose name I want to put on the agenda for our discussions and who has informed the work that I want to just briefly present, that I've been engaged in both Australia and Britain, is the work of Pierre Bourdieu, whose very influential account of the relationship between the art fields and the social fields in 1960s France, which has influenced countless studies since, suggests that the institutions and practices of art, just as much of those of literature or other art forms, are inscribed within processes of social differentiation. And Bourdieu's account goes roughly along the lines of saying that there are institutions of the cultural legitimation and consecration in our societies which determine that some kinds of art have high status and official value and other kinds of art don't. That there is a powerful connection between these institutions of art and cultural legitimation and the educational institutions of our society, such that the educational institutions within our society will tend to reward and recognize people who have developed skills in those forms of art and culture that are highly prized by the institutions of cultural legitimation, like art galleries and art museums. And that given that the schooling system tends to prize competence tends to prize these forms of cultural competence over competence in rap music or public art, for example, means that people who have acquired an at-home familiarity, particularly if they're the children of middle-class parents, with official or high cultural forms of cultural capital, people who have acquired skills and familiarity with conventionally valorized forms of high culture, will do well at school. As a consequence, they'll go on to university. As a consequence, they will tend to be recruited into highly paid, high-status management and professional positions, and as a consequence, as a way of symbolizing and displaying their kind of like superior status and occupational prestige, they'll go to art galleries a lot, they'll go to musical concerts a lot, they'll go to the opera a lot, and those kinds of things. This is undoubtedly true. It's a more powerful statement than I'm going to be able to justify adequately in the time that's available to me. But I want to quote from you a couple of passages from people at the different ends of the social spectrum in Britain. From a study that I did together with a number of colleagues in Britain, based upon a survey administered to 1,800 people across the country, a survey asking people what kinds of art they liked, what kinds of literature they liked, what kinds of sport they liked, what kinds of books they read, what kinds of cultural knowledge they had, what kinds of sport they went to, what kinds of art institutions they went to or didn't go to, what television programs they liked, what films they liked. As broad a definition of culture as you could imagine. Here's quotations from a couple of people in quite different relationships to the institutions of art. The first is with the CEO of a finance company, university-educated, London-based. The interviewer asks, do you support any art organisations? Ellen says, oh yes, I'm a patron of the Tate and I'm a patron of the Royal Academy. Interviewer, Tate Britain or Tate Modern? Ellen, well no, it's the Tate, so it's both, if I could put it that way. And then the Royal Academy. And I thought, through a friend, a good friend, I'm a trustee of a trust connected with the Royal College of Music. But again, I think that's a combination of friendship and business. But all of those, they're supporting the arts in one way or another, aren't they? Interviewer. Yes, and how was it that you got into the Royal College of Music? Eleanor, as I say, because the director of the Royal College is a friend of mine. And she said, would I sit on, they were looking for a new trustee for one of their charitable trusts, and she said, would you sit on it? And I said, yes. But the other two are, just because I applied as one can, and as long as you're prepared to pay the fee, they're only too pleased to take your money, putting it very bluntly. The next passage is from an unskilled worker as a member of a focus group that we conducted in Swansea in South Wales. And he's responding to a suggestion that had been put to him by the moderator of the focus group that the Arts Council England, which was a partner in our project, was a partner in our project because it was interested to find out why some people didn't go to art galleries and art museums. And the response comes from the member of the group. They all insisted on giving themselves comical nicknames. Biff says, well, you said that some arts council is interested in our opinions. Moderator, yes, and they want your opinions. Spud, another member of the group, no disrespect to these people, but I still reckon they're not looking at the whole picture, right? Biff, I really don't think that people are interested in art and what the art galleries doing? Tom, there's probably about 25% of people who worry about it. So 75% of the people are more worried about what's going to happen to our kids coming through life and that. Biff, yeah, I'm telling you something now. I'd love to be in a situation where education wasn't a problem. We wouldn't have the health authority as a problem. We wouldn't be moaning at the council because we've got housing difficulties. And then for them, the Arts Council, to suggest that we've got problems with not going to art galleries and theatres, they need to get real. All right. Now, what I want to do in just a couple of minutes that remain to me is just expand from that a little bit and ask you to... I was amazingly canny in thinking that I should bring this quotation with me today because I didn't know what was going to happen. But I wasn't canny enough to bring with me my version of an MCA, which is not the Museum of Contemporary Art, but a multiple correspondence analysis of our key findings in Britain concerning people's different patterns of involvement in different forms of culture. But I'm going to ask you to engage with me in it. Can people hear me if I move away from the mic? In a creative experiment. Multiple correspondence analysis is a statistical technique, the mathematical basis of which I do not understand. It's a statistical technique that converts, you usually get statistics in the form of tables. Multiple correspondence analysis converts statistics into visual representation of practices and lays them out on a picture, on a flat surface, so that you can see how different practices are related to one another. And the multiple correspondence analysis we conducted of our statistical inquiry into people's cultural taste, their knowledge, their interests, their practices, resulted in a picture which, if I brought it with me, I would show you, but I'm going to ask you to imagine it. It resulted in a series of dots, if I projected it on a space like this. And each dot would have around it something like art gallery often, or art gallery not so often, or likes impressionism. And each dot would be the statistical mean point for the people who like those practices or are engaged in those practices. So if there's a dot that occurs here called Art Galleries 2, it would have meant that's the place, that's the visual representation of the statistical mean for all of the people who like going to art galleries often. And the key point about multiple correspondence analysis is when activities are closely related to one another, it means that the same kinds of people are doing them. All right? And if they're far apart, it means that they're disconnected from one another. There's a big statistical gap between them. So roughly speaking, and I'm only going to talk about one aspect of our study, roughly speaking, what did we find? And I just want to tell you what we found down here. We found dots here saying going to art galleries often, liking Impressionism, liking Renaissance art, going to the theatre, going to the opera, going to orchestral concerts, not liking television, right? Not watching television more than an hour a day, owning lots of pictures, owning lots of books. Up here, we'd find things like modern art, not down here, but up here, like modern art, like going to rock music concerts, as well as going to instead of going to orchestral concerts. On this side, what mainly came across was people don't go to the theatre, they don't go to art galleries, they don't go to museums, they don't like Impressionism, they don't like modern art, they don't go to orchestral concerts, they don't even go to rock music concerts. The two things that came across here statistically most positive that they did do, I should have said, people over here like eating out at French restaurants. People here like eating fish and chips. And they like watching television 5 hours a day. And they like soap operas. Now, the point about this, that's a distribution of people's cultural interests and activities. You can do the same thing for people's social class position and map it on to this space. And you can do the same thing for their education position. And you can do the same thing for their age. Roughly speaking, what happens is this side of the map was occupied by people in working class occupations. Here, people in intermediate class positions. And almost exclusively over here, this lower right-hand quadrant where all of the liking of the art institutions and so on was concerned, were people in professional and management occupations. They were also by and large people over 55. The people that liked modern art were people of 35 and under. The same thing with a graph you could do. The people over here had no secondary education or only lower secondary education, to moving over people with university education. Now, I don't think there's anything new about this, and the study that those findings that I very briefly summarized was derived from was, as I said in the first case, Pierre Bourdieu's study of social practices in 1960s France, but it was also in between derived from a study that I've been involved with in two Australian colleagues, John Froe, now at Melbourne, and Mike Emerson at the University of Queensland when I worked at Griffith University, published in a book called Accounting for Tastes, which showed pretty much exactly the same pattern. This is not something that's just true of Europe and not of Australia. It's true of pretty well all kinds of modern societies. Now, I say this not to, this is not, why do I want to point this out? For a couple of reasons. It's really to point out that when it comes to art practices like, well, good, 2 microphones is tricky to handle, 1 is easier. It's not because I want to be critical of or to undermine the integrity or what's at stake at all in critical public art projects, critical contemporary public art projects that are concerned to make a difference to the forms of the ways in which art engages with the public and the ways in which public engages with the art. It's not because I want to deny or belittle the arguments that artists will make and art institutions will make that art can make a difference through shifting modes of perception, all right? And allowing familiar problems to be seen in new ways. But it is to say that the history of art institutions has for a long time, I mean, for at least a century and a half, been inscribed by a kind of like a double tension. On the one hand, art institutions do work, some more than others, are implicated in the processes of class differentiation in our societies, and at the same time, within those institutions, there are different wings of their activities that are engaged in processes of precisely trying to overcome the dominant patterns of reproducing the association between artistic practices and elite strata of society. I wanted to draw attention to this because I think it's a part of the nature of the relationships between art fields and art institutions and society that all artistic practices need to, in some sense, be aware of and relate themselves to consciously in their strategies.
I won't talk for too long. When I was thinking how I might be useful today, I thought there's a chance that I could talk about some of these relational kinds of projects that I've been involved with myself as an artist, or I could talk as a writer and critic. But I thought perhaps the best use is to talk from my position as the chair of the board of Information and Cultural Exchange, which is a Western Sydney cultural organisation which works principally with youth, principally in audiovisual, electronic arts, film, sound, songwriting, writing, and online web kind of projects. Being on the board is not being in the organisation, it's not doing all of the hard work, but it's being in a governance role, being close by and being reflective, being able to see some of the patterns that are occurring inside the organisation and in the organisation's relationship to the world that it works with, being able to observe those and offer them back to the people who are doing the hard work. Some of the observations I've developed about the kind of work that is happening, which is community and cultural development work that is happening with Information and Cultural Exchange. Some of the observations I've got about how that work proceeds well or not well, how the organisation Information and Cultural Exchange works well or not well. Some of those observations align quite well to some of the things I've heard today. So I'd just like to propose, in a way, 4 key words that I often have in my head as I go into the meetings and as I go out to Parramatta to hang out with the folks there at ICE, Information and Cultural Exchange. And I like to remind myself that a lot of what we do is about these 4 ideas: availability, impetus, conviviality, and discourse. Availability, impetus, conviviality, discourse. Think about whether any of these words work about in relation to the things that we've thought about and talked about today. I'll have to gloss the words because they have all sorts of connotations, but in my mind, a lot of what one does in this relational sort of work, a lot of what we do at ICE is the organisation makes itself available to the people who might be working with it. The people who come in and work in the organisation on a project usually need to make themselves available to each other. This is a simple enough thing to say, but often in a project, let's say a hip-hop songwriting workshop out there, there'll be some Somali kids, some Pacific Islander kids, some Vietnamese kids, and some of them are kids and some of them are not kids. Some of them are 17, some of them are 23, some girls, some boys. To be in a room where people of those differences, all with one unified interest, can make themselves available to the project and make themselves available to each other, that's a crucial issue. And as I've thought about and looked at and operated in and reviewed a lot of relational aesthetics work in the last 15 years or so, I've come to understand that the way that I like to think of relational aesthetics is it's availability aesthetics. What's the beautiful idea that's in there and how are people available to the idea? And what happens when that availability is accorded to the idea and to each other? So availability. Impetus, you can't just get people in a room and say, so guys, be creative. There's got to be a push. It'll be either a council puts out a call for a particular type of project, there's a perceived need for something and someone decrees that it will go in this direction. Impetus, give it a push. Give it a push amongst a situation where people are available to each other and to the possibilities. Conviviality, safety might be another word for conviviality. How do people live together in that domain? How do they enact a kind of courtesy which is robust and resilient, which is critical, not just fuzzy, but is safe enough for whatever is made available to occur in ways that are disputatious and problem-solving over time. And discourse, the last one, and discourse for me is obviously discussion, but course is in it. How do things flow? How might some shift happen? And to me, that's when art happens. Art is a thing that is transformative. A join is made, this is joined with that, and some kind of turning occurs. Call it transformation, call it transcendence, but it's around an articulation, some corner turned. How, therefore, can a shift happen? How can discourse occur before the work, during the work, and critically, after the work as well? And particularly if this is a convivial circumstance, how do you set the safe conditions for the people who are making the work to discuss the disputatious aspects with each other and then to take the risks of doing the moves to make the work happen? And then crucially, how do you as an organisation provide the safety for the discourse that will happen afterwards? And sometimes it'll be some bullying kind of media squall. Other times it'll be a situation in which the degree of complexity is so extreme that an inordinate amount of time is required to go through all of the processes. Okay, how do you set that time aside? And how do you make sure that the safety is there for the discourse to happen? Because I think the discourse has to happen because the discourse is about shifts of feeling as well as shifts of ideas. So, to recap, availability, impetus, conviviality, discourse. The key things, I think, in the work that the folks out at ICE do and that I kind of nag away at them as on the board. But I think a lot of that, availability, impetus, conviviality and discourse, has been ramifying through, reverberating rather, through the discussions we've had today. Thank you.
Thank you all for delivering here a wide-ranging set of reflections. What I would like to do now is open up the floor and for anyone who is interested to make some comments, provide new perspectives, whatever. It's not really a question of asking questions to panels of members. That is not necessary. I think it's now kind of not a conversation that we can have here as a group of people here. What we've heard here just now is really, I think, just maybe the impetus for kind of further reflections. But yeah, so that's what I would say. So so you don't have to kind of like just ask a question or kind of whatever. So would you like, yeah? Lisa.
Those of you who know me well will know that I simply have to respond to Tony. It's been one of my lifelong challenges is to question exactly what he just did. And it's to do with terminology and the way that it is very easy to frame something according to terminology. I'm sure if you asked the participants in Sylvie's project, who clearly were not educated middle-class people, did they like modern art, they would say resoundingly no. And yet they were clearly taking part, giving significant resources over many years in terms of their time to a project that I certainly define as art. And I would say the same for Glenn Matthews at Panthers. I think if you said to Glenn, what do you think of modern art? He'd probably say, ooh, yuck, not for me. And yet there he is putting resources into Craig Walsh's project. So I think we have a bit of a problem if we actually don't examine the terminology in the way that we frame things. The reason why I feel passionate about this is I began my career, as I think Jock has mentioned, as a bus driver, taking exhibitions on board a travelling gallery around Scotland, and it was an extremely challenging and exciting job because everybody came into the bus. There were no preconceptions. It's not for me. People were curious. And my experience there was that people are and can be open-minded and interested in a whole range of incredibly complex ideas if they're presented in a way that makes people feel part of it and not excluded. So there has always been a real problem within the art world, and I'd be the first to admit it, which is that we create systems that exclude people. And one of the things that I think drives C3 West is trying to create new forms of practice and new forms of engagement that actually challenge those very ways of making people feel excluded. And I absolutely refute the idea that just because you live in Western Sydney, you can't be interested in complex ideas around contemporary art. And just finally, to prove that point, if I may, another anecdote, when the MCA was in a lot of trouble, one of the things we really tried to do was create partnerships in Western Sydney because we knew that how important it was to get rid of the charge of just being elitist and having a very small number of people here. And we formed an alliance with Blacktown, and I'll never forget the moment the mayor of Blacktown came down, was standing in front of a painting in the Sydney Biennale, and I said to him, "You're looking a bit quizzical, Mayor, what's wrong?" He said, "Well, I came today out of curiosity, never been in an art gallery like this before, but I really like this painting." I said, "Well, that's fantastic. What's the problem?" He said, "There's not a problem. I just didn't expect to like anything." So there we have the stereotype. He was assuming that he would come here, it would all be weird and wacky and out there, and he actually found himself liking something. A week later, he was on Alan Jones talking about what a great visit he'd had to the MCA. So he became an advocate for the work that we do here. So I think we have to be very careful about just buying into those stereotypes and not challenging some of the definitions that are often put onto things. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Helen, or do you want to respond, Tony, or maybe Helen first?
Yes, I would, because I wasn't trying to take away from the significance of the projects that have been discussed here at all, and I think they're terrific. I'm not trying to take away from the idea at all that art forms can reach out to Western Sydney from Eastern Sydney. I have absolutely nothing kind of like negative to say about that. Nonetheless, the points that you make I don't think quite touch the issue that I was concerned with. It's not, of course, people in Western Sydney as anywhere else can engage with complex projects, artistic and intellectual, if they're presented to them in the right ways that engage and so on and so forth. Of course that can happen. Of course, when you ask questions about do you like contemporary art, do you like modern art, do you like impressionism and so on, those questions are quite difficult, and it depends upon how people interpret them, exactly the pattern of response that you're going to get. Nonetheless, I would suggest that internationally the pattern of kind of like statistical evidence about this is pretty overwhelming. That even the facility to kind of like handle the categories and be comfortable about distinguishing between modern art, contemporary art, installation art and so on, these are not evenly distributed across the population. I don't think that people who don't have such facility are in any way kind of like suffering from a deficit. Not to be familiar with the world of art is not to be familiar with the world of art. People may well be familiar with other things in which their intellectual practices and skills are fully engaged, and they are entirely personally fulfilled and intellectually fulfilled as a consequence. Not being a part of the world of art, from my point of view, is not a problem. I'm quite on the side of Biff and Spud in some of those regards. But all of that said, it's not a question of whether, I wasn't talking about whether people feel excluded. I was talking about whether there are mechanisms of relationships between art institutions and education systems that have certain consequences for the reproduction of class divisions. And so we talk about the operations of the MCA program here in terms of outreach activities. No, well, sorry, you don't use that term, but well, no, but then, but what's the social composition of your regular visitors? Can you tell me?
Oh, absolutely we can tell.
Yeah, go on then.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to get into the debate.
Well, can I just...
So but my point there is that art institutions do many different things for different publics. And although it may be that an art institution is involved in kind of like public engagement projects that do certain kinds of things, they may also be involved in other projects that have contrary social consequences.
They're not contrary.
Well, there might be.
I think, can I just intervene here? And I think that one of the problems here, as Lisanne says, it is a question of definitions. And these definitions do circulate and are somehow, like how the concept of art is associated with a particular class out there in society is something that actually difficult to control, and that's actually precisely why projects like C3 West are very, very kind of challenging projects, precisely because it is an attempt to transcend those dominant definitions, and it actually just shows to me anyway that projects like C3 West are even more complex and challenging and difficult perhaps than many of us might think, and therefore all the more important. And I think this definition of art, I think that's really one of the problems with a lot of the surveys, that they will kind of assume that everyone knows what those categories are and what kind of associations they have, and we have to move away from those dominant definitions in order to be able to open up spaces, to liberate people's imaginations, to kind of engage with these kinds of projects. And I think it is always going to be a very slow process, what we have actually really found today. But I think, Helen, you want to say something?
Yes, I'm getting really agitated here. I don't agree at all with what you're saying, Tony, and I agree with you completely. But even more so, I don't think it's difficult in the case of Western Sydney, because Western Sydney has its own incredibly vibrant, incredibly exciting art scene. And it seems to me, having engaged in it, living in Paddington, going to yet another boring French Impressionist thing at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which earns lots of money. And I go out to Western Sydney and find art. And I find it happening across all sorts of diverse education levels, diverse individuals from diverse countries and diverse ages. I mean, I could go to Blacktown Art Centre to listen to a talk, and there might be 5 people there, and those 5 people might be 5 housewives of Anglo-Celt type, engaging with really provocative art from an young Indian artist. And nobody cares out in Western Sydney what Eastern Sydney's thinking. They're not interested in people being patronizing towards them. It's irrelevant. And what's going on in Kazula Powerhouse is so exciting. So I just think, you know, those sorts of questions that you raised and those sorts of surveys are really irrelevant in this context.
Sylvie.
I just want to say that you say that the company makes the flight, but I just want to remember you that if there wouldn't be a pilot in the plane, you wouldn't have had the 11th of September. For me, it's very important to say that. What is also important, we have Bourdieu, but we have also the philosopher Jacques Rancière. And I think it's very important to stop to think that the people have no thoughts. That there is only one part of the population who has a thought and not the other one. It's like in the little video I have shown when the black woman says, solitude should be for the rich people. But we have also idea about solitude. So I think what interests me in CCUS project with the Panthers is how to find a translation. First, because it's not my language, but also because the Panthers are not really used to be in the art field, but I am not only used to be in the rugby field myself. So when we have meetings, I can feel the moment where perhaps we are too abstract or we are too far. And then this is a very unbelievable moment when we have to find new words, new way to have some feeling with the other one. I don't know if I'm clear about that, but for me it's very important. It's a question of movement. How you created the movement between two persons who doesn't have especially the same life, the same area to think, the same issues. And for me, this is a challenge between us. It's not a question of trade would give money. It's not that at all. It's something much more complicated. It's how we can begin to talk together. Means to talk together is to take place, each of us, not one on the other one, on one to the next one, but really gives a place to the other one. And I think this is a big challenge. And this provoke movements and not something with a closed form.
Thank you. There's somebody in the back who wants to respond, I think, and then after that.
This is partly to Tony and Lisa as well. I'm just wondering how we develop institutions that can deal with this. I mean, this comes from a background of thinking that, look, there's been work like this going on in Australia for over 30 years on quite a large scale, and yet the majority of people who've worked in it are disappeared or effectively invisible. And that's because the public art institutions are basically galleries and they're market-driven, or rather, their definitions of art are market-defined definitions of art, and they involve exhibitable objects. That's what they're set up to do, that's what they do best, and ultimately, that's what they find easy to do, and so they aren't really interested in a definition of art which I would think most people here would probably subscribe to, which is that artists should go out and change their culture. Now, that does not fit easily with large-scale public institutions. I'm just wondering, is it possible at all to move to a different type of public art institution which will enshrine this type of work, give it a history, allow people to continue to learn from it, rather than for it have to be basically reinvented, project after project after project?
That's a good question. Yeah. Okay. We keep that open. Maybe some people might want to respond to that question. I think it's an important question, how to have an institutional context that can really provide the resources, the space, the time, the personnel to kind of make projects like C3 West a sustainable project into the future. But I think there is here, Karen?
Yes, I think that it might be fruitful to move this discussion further into a discussion of the language that we use. One of Tony's earlier questions had to do with the kinds of conflicts that emerge, and there was conceded that inevitably they do emerge. I mean, there are internal discussions, there are problems in realizing these kinds of projects, and much of it does have to do with the terms that we use. The words that we use very often are already filled with content when we use them, whether it's a survey about cultural practices, or where we use words like modern art or whatever, or whether it's within trying to formulate a project that's building on new kinds of collaboration. In my own, in the project that I reported on, one of the very real problems that we had was what my role in relation to the artworks was. And I used the term documentation. I said, what I want to do as a researcher is simply follow your process and document it. I should never have used that word. That documentation is something that, for the artists I was trying to talk to, was filled with another content. Documentation was what they did with their work. It was what that they would then give them something that they could work with in a whole range of ways. They didn't want to give that power to me. And I think that my point is that we shouldn't just try to make these, I don't think anyone here is just trying to make these into wonderful utopian fairy stories. I mean, that was, but rather to discuss the ways you work through the conflicts that are inevitable because of institutions and their histories, because of class positions and their histories, and because of what people want to do as far as creative processes. To be very clear about the words that we use and the question, and to question the kind of content that we have for those terms. Every time a conflict arises, it becomes, at least from my experience as an ethnographer, it's something that you need to step back and look at and see what it is that makes it difficult to understand each other at that point.
That certain words really come
Certain
with
words
such
are
baggage.
loaded. Yeah,
that maybe one of those words is art, actually. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's somebody there in the back.
I just need to stare. Yeah, I was actually born in a small village very near in the north of Italy, very close to Trieste. And although I left when I was 3, and my family moved to Milan, and then I lived all my life in Rome before coming here. I used to go back on holiday in the summer, and my relatives used to run the local wine bar, okay? And one thing that really amused me and interested me when I was a kid, I don't know if that was a long time ago, was that after midnight, all the local working class, very much working class, patrons of this wine bar, because they was very close to a very large shipyard, the biggest one in Italy, they still make very large ships, like cruise ships in Monfalcone. People used to sing opera, and they used to know the opera arias, they used to do duets, and they used to do, the male and female part. They all used to sing until 2 o'clock in the morning. Moved back to Australia, and opera is here the clearest example of what Tony Bennett was talking about. Over 55, middle class, middle to high class, the most elitist of the elitist, the most stereotype of the elitist arts. So the areas are exactly the same. So the content is exactly the same. It is simply the shift of cultural context has completely transformed the kind of political and social association of exactly the same product. Obviously, I'm not offering here a solution to this very complex, very difficult kind of issues, but just to see how just shifting a context, if it's possible to work on a context, which in a way is not too different from what Tony was trying to say, if it's possible to modify the institutional and social context, then we wouldn't have, art would assume a completely different meaning, a completely different way of interacting with society. So, I mean, I think that it's still possible to work in that way.
Thank you. Any further comments? It's here.
Just following on from some of the discussion and questions, and I'm a curator myself, and just reflecting on the fact that often when you are in an art project as an artist or an art worker or an institution, it's very difficult to know at the time what's happened sometimes, and not until later on you have a chance to reflect. And here we're talking about trying to build on a history and understanding of what we're doing in this practice and previously. So is it possible to hear a little bit from people involved in C3W about how you will evaluate this project, so there is knowledge that can be passed on or that we can learn and reflect on?
So is that a question? So your question was... Well, I mean, just to speak on behalf of the Art of Engagement Research Project, we have been involved with the C3 West people to actually in the process and learning together with Lisanne and John and many others, including also with the corporate partners and the artists to look at the evolution of Art of Engagement, and this particular event is really kind of a first step towards coming to a more public discussion about these kinds of issues and the challenges and the difficulties, as well as the enormous potential that I think is there. And we are really intending to turn this the presentations during this event into kind of a publication plus a few more reflective essays, hopefully, and hopefully that can then be used by other people as an inspiration. But I think, as has been said by many others, we don't think that there is a formula or a model that can simply be applied. Every situation is different, and I think that's perhaps one of the largest lessons that we can learn here, that the brokerage of bringing people together, the selection of the artists, and how the artist in the end works with the communities is such a fine-grained process. You can't actually really have a lot of kind of formulas about those. The biggest lesson is that a lot of time is needed and a lot of resources, and it's always also a risky process, and I think that's really an important thing, that we have to understand and accept that risk is part and parcel of this process. We can't think that there are guarantees of a project that will be fully successful, precisely because it's so complex, precisely because it works with so many different groups and people. The whole idea of risk and of danger is built into this kind of work, and in a way that's actually also how life works overall. So I think that's in a way kind of what we have to learn and accept. John? Yeah.
I'd agree with what Ian just said. But there's just a couple of sort of observations that I'd like to make in relation to the last 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. When you have a corporate partner and a community partner and an arts partner working towards or working in some kind of equilibrium of intent and some kind of equilibrium of outcome, the definitions of art give way to the value of the idea or the ideas that are coming forth from all three, from all the partners. The artist might be facilitating it, the artist might be provoking it, and I mean, I do think I was quite surprised in terms of some of the terminology that has been used, not only by Tony but by Ross as well. We've been actively. This is the first time when Ross spoke today. It's the first time, for example, that we have heard the term relational used, and C3 West has been deliberately eschewing terminology such as that for the best part of 3 years now. It's interesting to have it located in that sphere of discourse. I was also interested to see Tony buying so wholeheartedly into the very definitions of art that C3 West is trying to disrupt. C3 West was more about ideas. How we resolve the institutional framework might end up being hybrid of public institution, private sector, community, such as a model such as ICE might be working towards, such as the notions that Frank was talking about of collaboration and so on. So there's a whole range of complexity that defies simple stereotyping, which is exactly what we're trying to do. If that ends up in provoking a discussion about language and terminology, then that's fine. That's part of what we're also trying to do. So.
Max.
Just on the question about how we evaluate what we've done, from our point of view, it would probably be quite difficult to form, as you said, to create a formula to do that, and it certainly won't come from those standard formats that our accountants might like, return on investment and so forth. But I just want to say that one of the things that I think we can point very tangibly to, or point to a very tangible outcome of our involvement in C3 West, is the impact that it has had on the way we work, the way we value our offering. And as an example, Sylvie, when she was out here, spent some time with me and talking to all of us about we need to set the standard. We need to make the standard and make organisations like ING reach that standard. We should be in control. And one of the impacts that that's had on myself and therefore on our organisation is to actually have a look at some of the things, some of the offerings that we have in that building out there. And one of them in particular is a very good theatre. It's really well constructed, it's got fantastic acoustics, and it is just a great performance space. But it's been undervalued. We have treated it poorly. We have not delivered the community benefit that could be. So one of the impacts of our involvement with C3 West is to look at that and say, let's lift the standard, let's raise the standard, let's make this performance space, this very valuable proposition for our community, let's make it valuable. Let's give it some value. Let's treat it with the respect that it deserves and that our community deserves. And, you know, I think if we look at things in that way, taking the word discourse, what happened there was we've actually turned a corner. And our involvement in C3 West has enabled us to do that. And you know, I think that's the art. Mm-hmm. You know, you guys are using words that are full of meaning that I have no idea. But what I can say is that our involvement has been a really, really good thing for our organisation, and it needs to, and for our community. Mm-hmm. And I think the benefits of that probably won't be seen for some years. But I hope they do continue to be seen.
Thank you. There's one person here. I think we will go on for a few more minutes and then we will have the closure. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on this idea of discourse and how important that is in relation to C3 West. And I think where the discourse could be really interesting is if the project doesn't become defined. I think that's really important. As an artist in this project, I felt I had the freedom to produce a work. If the concept developed to an outcome which was a gallery-based photographic show, I had the freedom to do that. So I didn't feel it was a CCD project. I didn't feel it was a gallery project or a satellite site project. I had this freedom to explore the ideas, explore the site, and come up with an outcome that best was influenced from that experience. So I think the discourse is a very long process. I think what we need is a whole lot of outcomes from different types of artists who actually approach and work in those areas in very different ways. And I would hope that, you know, these sort of discussions don't start defining what C3 West is too much, because I think that's the real difference in this project to many other projects.
Okay, well, maybe I can just conclude perhaps by saying that it's really not about kind of reinforcing stereotypes, and I'm sure that that's also not been Tony's intention, but it's actually what we can perhaps say also after Craig's last statement here, that the definitional shouldn't be too imposing of what's happening. What these kinds of projects are trying to do is precisely moving beyond stereotypes, moving beyond entrenched definitions and perceptions, and that the freedom and the space that opens up is where the experimentation can happen. Now, of course, that is always going to be very hard, because those stereotypes, we don't have control over them, and out there we have a big media world that perhaps will constantly bring those stereotypes up again, etc., etc. So I think this is going to be an ongoing project, and I'm very, very pleased that we have come this far. I think C3 West has shown, and I think you will all agree that what has happened today and what you've heard today does provide a lot of food for thought for further development along these lines, and I hope that it will happen. It's work in progress, and I think continuingly so. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this discussion. But before you all kind of stand up, etc., I'd like to give the last word to Elaine Lally.
Thanks. And just before we finish, there are some thanks and acknowledgements that need to be made, and we'd like to invite you all to stay and join us for a drink and do some more informal networking. But first of all, we really need to acknowledge the very important support, without which none of us would be here, that the funding bodies have given to C3 West, the New South Wales Government through Arts New South Wales, and the Australia Council through the Community Partnerships section, and also specifically in relation to today the Embassy of France, who has supported the travel of François Daune. I'd also really like to thank, we'll just basically put publicly on the record really, the appreciation of everybody. I'm sure I'm speaking for C3 West here, as well as us as researchers, to all of the C3 West artists, and to everyone who's been involved in the C3 West projects who's actually come today, and I'm thinking of Max and the people from Penrith Council who've been here. Also, there are some people here who worked on the Activate 2750 project, Alex, Lucy, Nathan, and Gianni. I'm not sure whether he's still here. There may be others. I'm sorry if I didn't spot you as we were going through the day. For the Art of Engagement project specifically, I mean, I did say thanks this morning to the research partners, but I specifically, sort of personally, and I'm sure on behalf of Ian and Kay, really want to thank Lizanne, Judith, Abby, John, Con when he was at Kazula, and now the staff of Kazula who are here. Brianna's here, Paul is here, there may be some others, Lisa, Jock, and really everyone who was involved in the research. For today specifically, all of the staff of the MCA who've done such a fantastic job with the catering, the venue management and the graphic design of the program, and we just really appreciate that assistance that's been given to us. All our speakers and chairs, I'll ask you to help thank them in a second. Lee and Rob for the audio visual support. All of the CCR staff, feels like an Oscar speech. I feel like the music should be coming up in a second. The CCR staff who've worked so hard to make the symposiums a success. Jackie, who's still here. Sally, behind the camera. Nathaniel, who's a friend of Sally's. Back at the office, Tulika, Rena, the other Jackie. But particularly Marie, who was here this morning, who is just, she's the rock that CCR rests on. The wonderful Michelle Kelly, who has, many of you will have corresponded with as part of today, who has also done a fantastic job as research assistant on the project. Philip Ma, who has also done fantastic work in supporting us as investigators on the project. Is that it? Have I forgot? I think that's... Yeah. Thank you all. Thanks for everyone for coming.